8th of April 1945, Friedrichsroda, Germany. Troops of the U.S. 354th Infantry Regiment captured the Gotha aircraft factory.
Newscaster in every newspaper across the nation has made headlines out of it, and this afternoon we are honored indeed to have here in our studio this man, Kenneth Arnolds, who we believe may be able to give us a first-hand account and give you the same on what happened.
Gentlemen, will you please take your seats so we can begin today's conference? I take a great deal of pleasure in presenting to you today as our guest speaker, Dr. Wernher von Braun. Dr. Braun.
Had a more or less crescent-shaped look, and it had a hole in the center of it. And, of course, I kept mulling in my mind, that's the damnedest looking airplane I ever saw.
Hello folks, thanks for being here and welcome back to the channel. Now first, and I don't normally do this, let me just say thank you so much to everybody that's interacted with my videos and channel over the last 6 months. I've gone from basically non-existent to very nearly being at the point when you get to 1,000 subscribers where YouTube will start paying me. And I can upgrade some of my very tired gear and buy my dog a squeaky toy. So thank you so much. It's literally been life-changing seeing the channel grow in this short amount of time. Now, on to the video. You've probably noticed the very provocative title and you're probably wondering what the hell is this about? Well, I have a very strong theory, but theory is still the operative word, about Kenneth Arnold's June 1947 sighting, which led to the creation of the term flying saucer, which we now know today. Now, I'm not going to retell his sighting in super granular detail because there's hour-long documentaries out there. I made a documentary, The 100 Years of UFO Sightings, and I talk about it a bit more in that. But the highlights: in June 1947, Kenneth Arnold had diverted a private flight that he was flying over Mt Rainier in Washington state. He was trying to see a crashed army transport plane. There was a reward of $5,000 up for anybody that could locate the wreckage. So whenever he was up just on a private flight, he would regularly divert and see if he could spot anything. On this particular day, he saw 9 craft that were kind of batarang shaped, or like a horseshoe crab, or a crescent with a triangle at the back. He said they'd got no tail, they were flying in a loose V formation like geese, and he was first alerted to it by being dazzled by the reflection of the sun off their wings. So he manoeuvred his craft so that he could have his window open, so there would be no dazzling of his own glass that he was looking through. And he said that the way that they were moving, when they were side on to him, he could barely see it because they were so thin. But when they caught the angle just right, it was reflecting the sunlight very, very harshly into his eyes, and they were moving at great speed. So I have a theory, given the time, place, and sort of cultural goings on, that may well explain what he saw. So without further ado, let's get into it. So this image shows the craft as best described by Kenneth, and his accounts of his sighting. The details did vary gradually the further away from the actual sighting. So I'm just going to start by playing you some footage of him describing it almost immediately after it happened.
Newscaster in every newspaper across the nation has made headlines out of it, and this afternoon we are honored indeed to have here in our studio this man, Kenneth Arnolds, who we believe may be able to give us a first-hand account and give you the same on what happened. Kenneth, first of all, if you'll move up here to the microphone just a little closer, we'll ask you to just tell in your own fashion, as you told us last night in your hotel room and again this morning, what you were doing there and how this entire thing started. Go ahead, Kenneth.
Well, at about 2:15, I took off from Chehalis, Washington, en route to Yakima, and of course every time that any of us fly over the country near Mt Rainier, we spend an hour or two in search of the marine plane that's never been found that they believe is in the snow someplace southwest of that particular area. That area is located at about, its elevation is about 10,000 foot, and I had made one sweep in close to Mt Rainier and down one of the canyons and was dragging it for any types of objects that might prove to be the marine ship. And as I come out of the canyon there, it was about 15 minutes. I was approximately 25 to 28 miles from Mt Rainier. I climbed back up to 9,200 feet, and I noticed to the left of me a chain which looked to me like the tail of a Chinese kite, kind of weaving and going at a terrific speed across the face of Mt Rainier. I at first thought they were geese because it flew like geese, but it was going so fast that I immediately changed my mind and decided it was a bunch of new jet planes in formation. Well, as the planes come to the edge of Mt Rainier, flying at about 160 degrees south, I thought I would clock them because it was such a clear day, and I didn't know where their destination was, but due to the fact that I had Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams to clock them by, I just thought I'd see just how fast they were going, since among pilots we argue about speed so much. And they seemed to flip and flash in the sun just like a mirror. And in fact, I happened to be at an angle from the sun that seemed to hit the tops of these peculiar-looking things in such a way that it almost blinded you when you looked at them through your plexiglass windshield. Well, it was about 1 minute to 3 when I started clocking them on my sweep second-hand clock, and as I kept looking at them, I kept looking for their tails. They didn't have any tails. I thought, well, maybe something's wrong with my eyes, and I turns the plane around and opens the window and looks out the window, and sure enough, I couldn't find any tails on them. And the whole observation of these particular ships didn't last more than about 2.5 minutes, and I could see them only plainly when they seemed to tip their wing or whatever it was, and the sun flashed on them. They looked something like a pie plate that was cut in half with a sort of a convex triangle in the rear. Now, I thought, well, that maybe they're jet planes with just the tails painted green or brown or something, and didn't think too much of it, but kept on watching them. They didn't fly in a conventional formation that's taught in our Army. They seemed to kind of weave in and out right above the mountaintops. And I would say that they even went down into the canyons in several instances, probably 100 feet. But I could see them against the snow, of course, on Mt Rainier, and against the snow on Mt Adams as they were flashing, and against a high ridge that happens to lay in between Mt Rainier and Mt Adams. But when I observed the tail end of the last one passing Mt Adams, and I was at an angle near Mt Rainier from it, but I looked at my watch, and it showed 1 minute and 42 seconds. Well, I still thought, well, that's pretty fast, and I didn't stop to think what the distance was between the two mountains. Well, I landed at Yakima, Washington, and Al Baxter was there to greet me, and saw up here. And he told me, I guess I better change my brand. But he kind of gave me a mysterious sort of a look that maybe I had seen something he didn't know. And, well, I just kind of forgot it then till I got down at Pendleton, and I began looking at my map and taking measurements on it. And the best calculation I could figure out, now even in spite of error, would be around 1,200 miles an hour, because making the distance from Mt Rainier to Mt Adams in, we'll say, approximately 2 minutes, it's almost, it'd be around 25 miles per minute. Now, allowing for error, we can give them 3 minutes or 4 minutes to make it, and they're still going more than 800 miles an hour, and to my knowledge, there isn't anything that I read about outside of some of the German rockets that would go that fast. These were flying in more or less a level, constant altitude. They weren't going up and they weren't going down. They were just simply flying straight and level, and I laughed when I told the pilots at Pendleton, I said, they sure must have had a tailwind. But it didn't seem to help me much. But to the best of my knowledge and the best of my description, that is what I actually saw, and like I told the Associated Press, I'd be glad to confirm it with my hands on a Bible, because I did see it, and whether it has anything to do with our Army or our intelligence or whether it has to do with some foreign country, I don't know. But I did see it, and I did clock it, and I just happened to be in a beautiful position to do it, and it's just as much a mystery to me as it is to everyone else who's been calling me the last 24 hours wondering what it was.
Well, Kenneth, thank you very much. I know that you've certainly been busy these last 24 hours because I've spent some of the time with you myself. And I know that the press associations, both Associated Press and our press, the United Press, has been right after you every minute. The Associated and United Press all over the nation has been after this story. It's been on every newscast over the air and in every newspaper I know of. The United Press in Portland has made several telephone calls here to Pendleton to me and to you this morning. And from New York, I understand they're after this story. And we may have an answer for it before night, because if it is some new type of Army or Navy secret missile, there will probably a story come out on it from the Army or Navy saying that it is a new secret plane, and that will be all there is to it, and they will hush up the story, or perhaps that we will finally get a definite answer to it.
Interesting. Now, I do not want to skew this to fit my theory, but it is worth considering. When you're in a plane which is moving and you see another object in the air, it is notoriously difficult to eyeball how fast it's going when you don't know what that vehicle is. It's much easier if you see something like an F-16 because you know it's 30 foot long. I mean, you can figure out from its published stats how fast it is. But if you see something which is anomalous, it's very difficult to know whether it's something far away and absolutely huge going incredibly fast, or a bug going past your windscreen incredibly slowly. Both would look exactly the same to you. So in order to judge 1200 miles an hour without knowing what you're looking at is very, very tricky. I'm not criticizing his ability as a pilot or his judgment, just putting it out there as something to consider. In fact, here's a quick example. So this video was submitted to Jimmy at the UAP Files during the attempted assassination of Donald Trump recently. And it appears to show either an insect moving past the camera relatively slowly, or a large craft in the distance going like absolute hell. The point is, it's incredibly difficult to tell when you don't know the specifications of the object. Now, 2 years before Kenneth Arnold's sighting saw the end of World War II, and with it the commencement of Operations Lusty and Paperclip. Now, I fully intend to do a video going into this in much more detail, because I'm not going to talk about this, the Die Glocke or the Hanabu or the proposed Nazi flying saucers as such. All I want to focus on for now is the fact that America and the Brits were panicked at the time because Russia, who had been their staunch ally at the end of World War II, helping to overthrow the Nazis, also laid claim to some of their scientists and engineers. And therefore, in Operation Paperclip, 1,600 Nazi scientists, SS officers and engineers were brought to the UK and America based on their skill set, as America, showing the first signs of the Cold War, didn't want Russia to have some of this phenomenally exotic technology going to them to be developed in secret. The term Operation Paperclip came from as simply as, if you were deemed to be useful to the West, you would have a paperclip put on your file which would exonerate you from the subsequent war trials, war crimes, and execution or persecution, regardless of what terrible things you'd been up to. Here is a photograph of Kurt H. Debus, who helped devise the V-2 rocket, which killed hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians, sat between John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. And here's a quick interview with Andreas Epp, who was undoubtedly brilliant as an aircraft designer, talking about how he was brought over with Operation Paper.
Auf Hannah auf den Helikopter und habe gedacht, man müsste doch eine Flugscheibe, so einen Deckel, müsste man in Natur, also in groß, müsste man doch zum Fliegen bringen können. Und dann fing ich an und habe diese Bierdeckel zur Flugscheibe ausgebildet. Auf dem Rückmarsch von Italien über Salzburg kam ich bei Ochsenfurt in Gefangenschaft. Man fragte nach einem Entlassungsschein oder so. Ich hatte keinen, also wurde ich gefangen genommen und in Ochsenfurt inhaftiert sozusagen als Kriegsgefangener. Aber kurz danach wurde ich aufgerufen und wurde von den Amerikanern eingeladen mit Entlassungsschein nach Freising, zur 7. amerikanischen Armee, zum Intelligenzcenter, wie es sich nannte. Dort waren auch mehrere, wie Hitler, sein Bruder, seine Schwester, manche Techniker und Ingenieure und Fachleute und Wissenschaftler. Und auch Wernher von Braun war auch dabei. Und weil ich sehr viel von Wernher von Braun hielt, wegen seinen Erfindungen und seinen Arbeiten an V1, V2, habe ich ihm mal von meinem Flugmodell erzählt, dass ich nichts mehr gehört hätte davon. Ja, sagt er hätte davon gehört, dass mein Modell dort angetroffen wäre und von Dornberger und einer Gruppe von Technikern erprobt wurde. Und da sagt er, ja, wenn du sowieso die Erfindung gemacht hast, warum kommst du nicht mit? Ich bin eingeladen nach Amerika, um dort Weiterentwicklung zu machen an Raketen. Und da habe ich gesagt, nee, 1 Monat nach Kriegsende und dann plötzlich von Amerikanern eingeladen werden, um zu arbeiten. Nachher machen wir was, Erfindung und so weiter, und dann kriegen wir einen Tritt in den Hintern und ist der Fall erledigt. Ne? Denn ich war sehr misstrauisch als Kriegsgefangener, plötzlich solche Einladungen. Aber ich habe davon gehört, dass man Interesse hatte, diese Leute, die da eingeladen waren, möglichst unterzubringen bei den Amerikanern. Auch die Russen hatten Leute als Gefangene. Und wie ich dann erfuhr, soll Habermohl, der plötzlich verschwunden war, auch seine Frau und seine Kinder waren nach Russland exportiert, also gebracht worden, um dort weiterzuentwickeln. Und das gab mir so allerlei Gedanken, wenn die Russen das wüssten und die Amerikaner das wüssten, wegen Flugscheibenentwicklung und so weiter. Wie Miete soll nach Amerika gegangen sein und dort Weiterentwicklung gemacht haben. Da habe ich mir in Hamburg gedacht, nach meiner Rückkehr nach Hamburg, ich muss weiterentwickeln. Ich muss diese Sache nicht ruhen lassen, sondern das bin ich den Leuten schon schuldig, die daran gearbeitet haben und jetzt plötzlich namenlos waren. Da habe ich begonnen, eine Flugscheibe zu bauen, nicht eine Flugscheibe, aber einen Flugring, so wie ich es damals vorhatte bei Hannah Reitsch.
Wernher von Braun is one of the most recognizable figures in the history of spaceflight. But for those who don't recognize the name, who was Wernher von Braun? Wernher von Braun was born on March 23, 1912, into a family with Junkers heritage, a noble social class that traditionally dominated the Prussian military officer corps, the land-owning elite, and the offices of civil service. It was a heritage that was somewhat at odds with von Braun's love of spaceflight that he cultivated beginning at the age of 13 when his mother gave him a telescope for his birthday. Looking up at the night sky, von Braun imagined exploring the planets and stars, and possibly of building a rocket large enough to send men to the moon. Von Braun fixated specifically on the rocket that would enable man's foray into space. Towards the end of high school, he got his first hands-on experience with rockets when he joined the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, an amateur rocket society based in Berlin. It wasn't long before the German army took notice of this amateur rocket society's activities, and of von Braun in particular. And von Braun, in turn, took notice of the army, namely the army's money. He knew that to get his rockets off the ground, he would need military funding. It turned out to be a happy partnership. In 1932, when von Braun was only 20 years old, he had the German army backing his own research into rocketry. During the Second World War and on the army's dime, Wernher von Braun led the team that developed the V-2 rocket, the same rocket that the Nazis launched on London in the closing months of the war. But the V-2s used in combat weren't built at the research site in Peenemünde. They were built by concentration camp prisoners in underground factories near the German town of Nordhausen. His rocket's association with slave labor put von Braun in a tricky situation once the war ended. He was a technical genius guilty of war crimes. Eager to continue working on the rockets that would enable man's foray into space, and equally keen to avoid death, von Braun led his rocket team into safety by finding and surrendering to American soldiers. Under Operation Overcast and Project Paperclip, Most of von Braun's team was imported into America, along with recovered V-2s and supporting documentation and hardware. What was supposed to be a short-term arrangement turned into a permanent situation. Most of the scientists became naturalized Americans, including von Braun, beginning their American tenure by launching V-2s from a test site in White Sands, New Mexico.
A brilliant summary of von Braun by the fantastic YouTube channel The Vintage Space, which I really recommend you check out if you're into space and rocketry and stuff like that. However, I can't bite my tongue. This is a perfect example of the sort of modern Disneyfied narrative of some of these characters. Von Braun was a very high up SS officer. He was very proudly following that train of thought, and his factory, which we briefly mentioned was a concentration camp, what they used to do was work their people to death on the assembly line and then leave the bodies there by the side of the assembly line as an example to the other prisoners of what would happen if you didn't pull your weight and carry on working. This is a very grave example, whether it be the SS officers that formed Plum Island and designed Lyme disease, infecting ticks with it to drop on enemy soldiers in the trenches, or the UK funding bioweapons research. It was just proof that you can be the worst inhumane bastard and still have a statue put up in your name as long as you're useful to the military-industrial complex. But that is a conversation and a track that I really don't want to go down and isn't relevant to this video.
April 8, 1945, Friedrichsroda, Germany. Troops of the US 354th Infantry Regiment captured the Gotha aircraft factory, the edge of the Thuringian forest. For 3 days, the 354th, part of the US 89th Infantry Division, had fought through German defenses to reach the town. At the factory, American troops made a fascinating discovery: 4 steel and wood prototype aircraft, all in various states of manufacture. Only the fuselages and engines were present. The wings were made elsewhere. But it was obvious from their unusual design that the aircraft was something new and revolutionary. Shortly afterwards, a specialist team from the US 8th Army Air Force, operating as part of Operation Paperclip, arrived to examine the planes. Operation Paperclip was the secret American plan to grab Nazi technology for themselves. They quickly selected the most complete for immediate shipment to the US. The rest were ordered destroyed to prevent the Soviets from demanding an example. What the Americans had found was the strange and ultra-modern Horton Ho 229 flying wing. A pair of bat-shaped wings were next captured by the US Army 75 miles away and shipped with the fuselage for intensive study and evaluation in America. The head of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, had set a challenge for Germany's wartime aircraft industry when he demanded what he called the 3x1000 aircraft. That is, an aircraft that could carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs, 1,000 kilometers at 1,000 kilometers per hour speed. 2 designer brothers, the Hortens, had a proven track record for producing unusual cutting-edge aircraft designs. Experimenting with the flying wing since the 1930s, work began in 1942 on the Horton Ho 9 to compete in the 3x1000 tender. A single prototype was built called V1. It first flew on the 1st of March 1944, though not under power, as the type's engine was changed and would not fit the V1. So a series of glider tests were made at Oranienburg near Berlin in the summer of 1944. A second prototype, V2, was fitted with 2 Junkers Jumo 109-004B1 turbojet engines. This aircraft logged some 2 hours flying time from the 2nd of February 1945, with Lieutenant Erwin Ziller at the controls. Göring awarded the 3x1000 contract to the Hortens, ordering 40 aircraft. The V2 was destroyed on the 18th of February 1945 while Ziller was attempting to land on one engine. Nonetheless, Goering added a further 20 aircraft to the pre-production order, and the Horton Flying Wing Fighter project was green-lit on the 12th of March 1945. Goering's original demand for an aircraft capable of carrying a 1,000-kilo bomb load was overtaken by the need for fighters capable of stopping the Allied bomber offensive against Germany. The aircraft has often been called the first stealthy plane, but it was not designed with radar evasion in mind. The aircraft was very lightweight, being constructed out of cheap materials available to war-ravaged Germany in the last months of the war. The wings were made of carbon-infused plywood stuck together with a glue made of sawdust and charcoal. The emergency fighter program used several different aircraft designs, including some that actually entered combat, such as the Heinkel HE-162 Salamander, but the Horton Flying Wing lagged far behind. The shape and materials certainly reduced the aircraft's radar profile, which was a useful outcome, and the V-2 prototype was apparently tested against the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter, and the Horton had superior handling characteristics, but Zille was killed and the V-2 destroyed before more extensive tests could be conducted. If it had entered service, the single-seater Horton HO-229A was to have been a fighter with a maximum speed of 960 km per hour, that is 600 miles per hour. Armed with two Mk-108 30mm cannon, it had retractable tricycle landing gear and a drogue parachute to slow the aircraft on landing. The pilot wore a special Draeger pressure suit, as the service ceiling was 15,000 meters or 49,000 feet. Following the destruction of V-2, work was moved to the Gotha plant at Friedrichsroda. At this point, the type was renamed the Horton 229. Prototype V-3 was powered by two Junkers Umo 109-004C turbojets and was fitted with an ejection seat. V-4 was to have been a two-seater all-weather fighter and night fighter, as well as V-5, while V-6 was a single-seater fighter with better cannons, but the advance of US forces ended efforts to get another Horton 229 airborne. V-3, the most complete, was sent to the Foreign Aircraft Evaluation Branch at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, for very extensive tests and evaluation. Unpowered glider versions of the type were taken to the US for testing. A team from the British Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, the CIOS, discovered three complete Horton Flying Wing gliders stored on trailers with all instruments intact at Rottweil on the Neckar River, 100 kilometers or 60 miles southwest of Stuttgart on the 11th of June 1945. The British gave the aircraft to the Americans, who shipped them to Wright Field. HO-229 V-3 is the only surviving version of the aircraft in the world and is currently on static display at the Stephen S. Udvar Hazy Center at Washington Dulles International Airport.
Now, it is a matter of fact that the USA and the UK and virtually everybody would attempt to study and back engineer any cutting edge technology owned by a foreign power. There's perfect evidence of this in the V1, the Doodlebug, which is identical to America's first cruise missile, which you'll see here. David Grush has said in Congress under oath about the recovery of the 1933 craft from Magenta in Italy, which was recovered to the US and then sequestered away to a private aerospace manufacturer that we don't know about yet. If you want to know more about that particular case, I recommend you check out this video that I made, Trust Wars, which really analyzes what he said about that particular case. But anyway, what we know is that if the US military recovered some exotic aviation or other technology, it would be recovered to a military base and then passed on to one of the main manufacturers for study, back engineering and hopefully technological development. Who better than Boeing? At the time, Boeing made 28% of all of the planes in use in America. So if you just recovered a very exotic looking German cutting edge warplane with no tail or ailerons on the back, who better to look at it than the person that was responsible for making the most cutting edge technology that you had in the sky at the time? So why pick on Boeing? Haven't they got enough problems? Well, I pick it on Boeing in particular because Boeing had a particular tendency to make aircraft in bright silver finish, or just a highly polished metallic finish, as you can see from all the wonderful different myriad of different shapes that they make, a few examples of which I'll put on screen here. But you can imagine how eye-catching and dazzling that would have been were it to catch the sun and be reflected at you, especially from a distance traveling at great speed. So that's one little part of the puzzle. The really interesting bit though is where Mt Rainier is in relation to Boeing. So have a look on this map. This is Mt Rainier marked here, just sort of southeast of Seattle. And this is the training flight path that Boeing use and have used since they were first formed in about 1915, I think it was, which takes it in exactly the same area over Mt Rainier. So, and let me just reiterate that you need to be slightly speculative here, because I couldn't trace where that went after it was recovered to Wright-Patterson and how it is now on display in the Air and Space Museum. So let's just imagine for a second it went to Boeing. Boeing built a few to test out the aeroframe and see what it could do. And then during a test flight one day, painted in its reflective silver, as was the style of the American planes, because you're not going to paint it up in its Nazi colours and fly it over mainland America, it is spotted by Kenneth Arnold.
At this point is when I would say approximately is where I had this terrific flash hit the air. My aircraft lit up the inside of my aircraft, and I assumed, of course, at the time in a split second that it was probably a P-51 fighter that had dove over my nose, and that it was the sun's reflecting upon these bright wing surfaces that caused it. However, before I gathered my wits together, I looked way off here to the north, and then when I saw where the flash came from, it was an echelon formation of very peculiar-looking aircraft, and they were rapidly approaching Mt Rainier, and it was at about this point when I got here I could see their tail surfaces, or the rear end of them, and the second craft from the rear had a more or less crescent-shaped look, and it had a hole in the center of it. And of course I kept mulling in my mind, that's the damnedest looking airplane I ever saw. I looked at my sweep second hand on my 24-hour clock, and they had covered this distance of approximately 50 miles in 1 minute and 42 seconds. It is placing their speed at approximately 1,700 miles an hour, 1,781 it came out at that distance, which was, of course, unheard of in 1947. I says, well, I tell you, they flew erratically like a saucer would if you skipped it across the water. And, of course, then, all of a sudden, the term flying disc and this type of thing, or crescent-shaped or whatnot, was completely dropped, and everybody started seeing flying saucers.
So, today is not the day for a discussion of how the phenomena can manifest itself in various shapes and forms, depending on sort of cultural references. Betty and Barney Hill seeing the craft and creatures that had been on the Outer Limits just a few weeks before. So, with all the public talking about flying saucers, perhaps this is where they took note and started to represent what the public were expecting to see. What I will say, however, as a final point on this, is you'll notice in that second interview there, he said that it was perhaps doing 1,700 miles an hour. Well, in other interviews, Kenneth said specifically it was definitely faster than a P-38, which could do 440 miles an hour. He also said it was doing between 600 and 700 miles an hour. And the full specifications of the actual Horton 229, it was 24 feet long, it was 55 feet wide, only 1.1 meters or 3'7" tall. So you can imagine that thing side on being virtually invisible from a decent distance. And it had a cruise speed of 560 miles per hour with a top speed of 620 miles per hour. So when you think about those sort of figures, you're definitely in the ballpark for what he was describing. Anyway, I'm not going to give you any further conclusions than that. I've presented all the facts. I've emailed a few sort of World War II specialists for their opinion, but frankly, when you send somebody an email with the words Nazis and flying saucers involved, you're probably not going to get a reply back. Thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one.